You have found Sherlock Mysteries, where hidden truths come to light. Kindly like and subscribe to Sherlock Mysteries. Which part of the world are you watching from? Tonight's intrigue begins. Chapter: I fey the scent in the fog. London lay that morning beneath a pall of fog so dense and yellowed that it seemed less a phenomenon of weather than a deliberate conspiracy of the city itself. From the windows of our sitting room at 221B Baker Street, I could scarcely distinguish the opposite houses. Their outlines wavered like spectres, half inclined to manifest and half ashamed of their intrusion upon the living. The clatter of hansom cabs was muffled to a distant rumor, and the cries of street vendors drifted upward as disembodied laments. Within, however, the coal fire burned with a steady glow, casting warm reflections upon Holmes's chemical apparatus and the well-thumbed monographs scattered about his writing table. Holmes sat in his customary armchair, long limbs folded with feline economy, his sharp profile etched against the gloom. His fingers were steepled beneath his chin. His eyes, half closed, gave him the appearance of one who listens intently to a faint melody inaudible to others. I had learned to respect that posture. It signified neither indolence nor reverie, but rather the swift, silent march of his analytical faculties. It was into this atmosphere that Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard burst with unusual urgency. The door had scarcely opened before the fog seemed to enter with him, curling about his overcoat like some clinging companion unwilling to release its hold. "Mr. Holmes," he began without ceremony, brushing moisture from his sleeves, "I fear we have encountered a matter that refuses to conform to any sensible pattern." Holmes did not immediately respond. He extended one long arm toward the fire, as though warming not his hands, but his thoughts. "Pray be seated, Lestrade," he said at last, in a voice as calm as the still air before a storm. "Your agitation is sufficiently evident, Watson. Oblige us with a chair. Now, what singularity has compelled you to brave our London atmosphere at so early an hour?" Lestrade seated himself, though not comfortably. He glanced at me, then back at Holmes, as if reluctant to expose his perplexity. "3 incidents," he said. 3 separate crime scenes in 3 distinct quarters of the city. No apparent connection, save one. Holmes's eyelids lifted a fraction. "Proceed." "The first occurred in Bloomsbury, an elderly scholar found unconscious in his study. No sign of struggle, no valuables taken. The windows secured from within. The second, 2 nights later, in Kensington, a retired naval officer discovered in a similar state, collapsed beside his escritoire. Again, no theft, no wounds, and last evening, in Wapping, a shipping broker was found insensible in his office, above the docks. Dead?" I asked. Holmes's fingers tightened together. "And the commonality?" Lestrade hesitated, as if the word itself were absurd. "A scent." Holmes's eyes opened fully now, keen and grey as steel beneath ice. "A scent," he repeated. "Yes." Each room bore the same uncommon fragrance. It lingered stubbornly in the air, strong enough to be remarked upon by attending constables, yet not so overpowering as to suggest spillage, more as though the air itself had been infused with it. Holmes rose in one fluid motion and crossed to the mantelpiece, where several small vials stood arranged with mathematical precision. "Describe it," Lestrade frowned. "It is no common cologne, sweet, but not cloying a trace of something resinous. Perhaps amber, and beneath it, a sharper note, not floral. Exactly. Something rarer." Holmes inclined his head. "Continue." "We traced the fragrance to a particular perfumer in Mayfair, one Monsieur Rourke. According to him, the scent in question is a private composition known as Velars Nocturne. Most exclusive. Only 3 bottles were ever produced, and each was supplied through a private commission." Holmes turned slowly. "Only 3. So we are assured. Each bottle was commissioned by a different gentleman of standing. Adrian Blackwood of Grosvenor Square, Mr. Charles Harrow, a financier residing in St. John's Wood, and Mr. Edwin Crowley, lately returned from India, who maintains chambers near Pall Mall." Holmes's gaze sharpened further. "And these men, Each claims that he did not leave his residence on the nights in question. Their servants corroborate their statements. Moreover, each bottle of perfume remains in his possession, scarcely diminished. For a moment, the only sound was the faint hiss of coal settling in the grate. Holmes resumed his seat, but the repose he assumed was deceptive. I could see the tension in the line of his jaw. You have examined the premises for forced entry thoroughly. Nothing. No broken locks. No disturbed windows. In each case, the victim was alone in his study. And the scent was detected where precisely? In the immediate vicinity of the desk or writing table. Holmes leaned back, eyes narrowing, curious. Lestrade shifted impatiently. You perceive something we do not, Mr. Holmes. Holmes ignored the question. Watson, he said instead, pray recall for me the properties of certain volatile organic compounds. I considered. Many evaporate rapidly at room temperature, yet can linger if absorbed into fabric or porous surfaces. Just so. And scent, unlike memory, does not fabricate alibis. Lestrade stared, meaning. Holmes rose once more and began pacing the carpet with long, deliberate strides. A fragrance, he said, is composed of particulate matter, however minute, dispersed through the air. It cannot materialize spontaneously. If present, it must have been introduced. If introduced, then by a hand, direct or indirect. But the bottles, Lestrade protested, are red herrings, Holmes replied softly. Or perhaps something subtler. He stopped before the window, peering into the swirling fog as though it might yield some hidden script. 3 victims, he murmured. A scholar, a naval officer, and a shipping broker. No theft, no visible injury. A rare perfume present at each scene, and 3 gentlemen in possession of that perfume, each secured by alibi. He turned abruptly. Tell me, Lestrade, what of the victims themselves? Do they share any acquaintance with Mr. Blackwood, Mr. Harrow, or Mr. Crowley? Lestrade hesitated. We have not yet established such a link. Then you must, Holmes said crisply, at once. The inspector rose. You believe the owners of the perfume are implicated? Holmes's lips curved faintly. I believe nothing, yet. But I observe that coincidence is a luxury seldom afforded by criminal enterprise. Lestrade drew on his gloves with a sigh. I had hoped for something more definitive. You shall have it, Holmes assured him. In due course. For now, we must visit Monsieur Rourke immediately. I asked. Holmes reached for his coat and deerstalker. Without delay, the fog will serve us admirably. Lestrade paused at the threshold. How so? Holmes's eyes gleamed. Because, my dear Inspector, fog conceals movement, and where there is concealment, there is often design. Within the hour we found ourselves conveyed through the shrouded streets toward Mayfair. The city seemed subdued beneath its vaporous mantle, as though complicit in some vast and secret undertaking. Holmes remained silent throughout the journey, his gaze distant, fingers occasionally tapping an inaudible rhythm upon his knee. At last we arrived before a modest, yet elegant establishment, whose brass plate bore the inscription, Matthias Rourke, Parfumeur. Inside, the air was rich with layered scents, citrus, sandalwood, rose, and stranger notes beyond my medical vocabulary. Shelves lined the walls, each bearing crystal bottles that caught and refracted the dim light like captured stars. Monsieur Rourke himself emerged from a rear chamber, a slender man of precise grooming, with dark eyes that flickered between us in swift appraisal. Holmes wasted no time. You are the creator of Villauer's Nocturne, I believe. A faint smile touched the perfumer's lips. A composition of some distinction, monsieur, commissioned under most particular instructions. By 3 gentlemen only, precisely. Holmes stepped closer. You are certain no additional samples were produced? Rourke stiffened. Absolutely certain. The formula is complex, the ingredients rare. What ingredients, if you please? The perfumer hesitated, then replied, ambergris aged patchouli, tincture of benzoin, and a distillation derived from a most uncommon orchid cultivated in Java. Holmes's eyes flashed briefly. An orchid. Yes, its oil is unstable unless properly treated. Most difficult to obtain. And the bottles, were they identical? Exquisitely so. Holmes inclined his head. Might we examine one? Reluctantly, Rourke retrieved a small, velvet-lined case. Within lay a crystal flagon of elegant design, its stopper cut with geometric precision. Holmes lifted it carefully, holding it to the light. 3 bottles only, he murmured. And yet the scent appears in places where none of these gentlemen claim to have been. He replaced the bottle. Monsieur Rourke, he said quietly, has any person besides the commissioners been privy to the formula? The perfumer's expression shifted, just perceptibly. My assistant, he admitted, a capable fellow, devoted to his craft. Holmes's gaze sharpened. And where is this assistant at present? Rourke swallowed. He has not reported for work these past 2 days. Holmes's eyes met mine, and I felt the familiar thrill of impending revelation. His name? Holmes asked. Thomas Rourke. Holmes's voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath it. Inspector Lestrade, he said, I believe we have corrected our first false trail, and thus commenced what would prove the strangest investigation of my companion's remarkable career. Chapter 2. Fay 3 bottles in London. If the events of the previous morning had stirred my curiosity, they had plainly ignited in Holmes a deeper and more sustained flame. He passed the greater portion of that evening in silent abstraction, surrounded by a confusion of chemical treatises, trade circulars from perfumers' guilds, and a well-thumbed atlas of London. He neither played his violin nor indulged in tobacco beyond the barest necessity, a restraint which, in my experience, signified the gravest concentration. It was shortly after breakfast, the following day, that he announced, without preamble, Watson, we must correct an error. An error. I echoed. Yes, the name of the fragrance, for one thing. But Inspector Lestrade distinctly called it Veuleur's Nocturne, Holmes finished. Yes, but Lestrade's account of its source was misleading. I have made certain inquiries through less official channels. The true trail leads not to Mayfair, but to Clerkenwell. And the perfumer? Not Monsieur Rourke of Mayfair, as we were led to believe. The scent was blended in Clerkenwell by an aging chemist named Matthias Rourke, who retired from trade last Michaelmas. I confess I stared at him. But how? Holmes smiled faintly. Lestrade's information was derived from invoices discovered in one of the gentleman's residences. The invoice bore Rourke's name, certainly, but the bottle itself, as described, did not conform to Rourke's customary design. I dispatched a boy from the Baker Street irregulars to make discreet inquiries among the trade. Rourke's name surfaced repeatedly. And you are certain? Holmes was already reaching for his coat. We shall be. Clerkenwell, with its narrow streets and industrious air, presented a stark contrast to the refined FFAs of Mayfair. We found Mr. Matthias Rourke residing above what had once been his modest shop. A narrow-fronted establishment with clouded glass, and a fading sign that still proclaimed M. Rourke Fay Fine Essences and Chemical Preparations. The man who admitted us was of advanced years. His figure stooped, but his gaze keen beneath heavy brows. His hands, though tremulous, bore the stains of long acquaintance with oils and tinctures. Mr. Rourke, Holmes inquired politely. I am he, the old man replied, though I no longer sell to the public. Holmes inclined his head. We come not as customers, but as seekers of information regarding a particular fragrance, Veuleur's Nocturne. At the name, a flicker of recognition passed across the chemist's features. That was a private commission, he said cautiously. So, I understand you will forgive our persistence, but the matter bears upon certain recent events of grave interest. Rourke studied Holmes for a long moment. There is about my friend an authority that often dispenses with official credentials at length. The old chemist gestured for us to enter. The room within was redolent of lingering essences. Amber, musk, faint citrus, though all subdued by time. Shelves lined the walls, bearing dusty jars and stoppered bottles. Veller's Nocturne, Rourke began, was devised at the request of a gentleman who desired exclusivity above all things. He wished for a scent that no other man in London might possess. And you complied. Holmes said softly. I did. Its composition was peculiar, amber resin as the base, rich and persistent smoked vetiver for depth, and a rare eastern blossom imported at considerable expense from the Levant. Its sweetness lingers longer than most florals. It clings. Holmes's eyes brightened almost imperceptibly. Clings? In what manner? To fabric, to skin, even to paper, if exposed sufficiently. Holmes exchanged a glance with me. You sold 3 bottles only? He pressed. Precisely 3. The first to Mr. Adrian Blackwood of Kensington, a collector of rare wines and rarer indulgences. The second to Mr. Charles Harrow of Bloomsbury, a scholar of antiquities, if memory serves. The third to Mr. Edwin Crowley of Hampstead, a gentleman of independent fortune. Each of means and unimpeachable standing? Holmes asked. Rourke nodded. So far as I was aware. Holmes stepped closer to one of the shelves, running a finger lightly across a row of stoppered vials. No duplication of the formula? He asked casually. None. I destroyed the working notes after the 3rd bottle was delivered, at Mr. Blackwood's insistence. Holmes turned sharply. At his insistence? Yes. He paid generously for exclusivity. Was any assistant present during the blending? Rourke's mouth tightened. My nephew, Thomas Rourke, assisted in procuring ingredients, but he lacked the knowledge to reproduce the compound unaided. And where is your nephew now? Gone to Manchester, seeking employment. Holmes absorbed this without comment. You are certain, he said at last, that no portion of the base mixture remained? Quite certain. Holmes inclined his head in thanks. You have been most helpful, Mr. Rourke. As we stepped once more into the grey London afternoon, Holmes's pace quickened. Well, Watson, he demanded. The chemist's account seems straightforward, I ventured. 3 bottles, 3 wealthy men, no theft, no duplication. Holmes smiled faintly. Just so, and yet our crime scenes bear the unmistakable trace of Veller's Nocturne. Then one of the owners must be lying, perhaps, Holmes conceded. But that conclusion is premature. We walked in silence for several yards before he resumed. You observed Rourke's description of the base notes. Amber resin and smoked vetiver, I replied. And the eastern blossom, Holmes added, a floral component whose sweetness lingers like a whispered promise, as he poetically expressed it. But it is the base that interests me. In what respect? Base notes are the most persistent elements of any fragrance. They evaporate slowly. If introduced into an enclosed space, they may remain detectable for hours, sometimes days, particularly if absorbed into porous material. You suspect the scent was not worn upon the person. Holmes stopped abruptly beneath a gas lamp, its glow diffused by fog. My dear Watson, he said quietly, we must not seek who owned it, but who wore it long enough for it to betray them. I considered this. You believe the wearer visited each scene? I believe, Holmes replied, that the scent did not travel independently. Someone bore it, consciously or otherwise, into those rooms. But the 3 gentlemen, Blackwood, Harrow, Crowley, each possess an intact bottle. Possession does not equate to innocence. Do you suspect a conspiracy among them? Holmes resumed walking. Observe the pattern. The victims thus far, a scholar in Bloomsbury, a naval officer in Kensington, and a shipping broker in Wapping. 3 districts. No theft, no visible violence, merely temporary unconsciousness. You imply deliberate incapacitation. Precisely, and what better means than a volatile compound dispersed subtly within a confined study? But the perfume may serve as a vehicle, Holmes interrupted. Or as a signature. A signature, I repeated. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Criminal vanity, Watson, is as common as human folly. To employ so rare a fragrance is to ensure distinction. Only 3 men in London might be suspected, a convenient narrowing of inquiry. Then the true culprit may not be one of them at all. Holmes's expression grew thoughtful. Consider also this. Mr. Charles Harrow of Bloomsbury, a scholar of antiquities. One of our victims was found in Bloomsbury. Mr. Adrian Blackwood resides in Kensington. Our second incident occurred there. And Mr. Edwin Crowley of Hampstead. Yet no incident has occurred in Hampstead. You think it will? Holmes's voice was calm. I think the pattern is incomplete. A chill, unrelated to the damp air, crept along my spine. Holmes drew his collar higher. It is the nature of the perfume's base notes that stirs my curiosity most keenly, he continued. Amber resin is often dissolved in alcohol, but smoked vetiver, when improperly distilled, may carry trace alkaloids capable of mild physiological effect. You mean? I mean, Watson, that scent may conceal more than identity. It may conceal intention. We had reached Baker Street once more. Holmes paused before ascending the steps. Tomorrow, he said, we shall call upon Mr. Adrian Blackwood. I wish to observe whether he wears his indulgence with pride or caution, and if he does not wear it at all, Holmes's thin smile returned. Then we must ask ourselves who does. As we entered our familiar rooms, the fog pressed close against the windows like a patient eavesdropper. I could not rid myself of the impression that somewhere within that murk moved a figure marked, not by sight but by scent, and that scent, rare and lingering, would soon guide us deeper into a design far more intricate than any of us yet perceived. Chapter 3, They the Rooms That Remembered. It has often been my experience that rooms, like men, retain impressions of what has transpired within them. The layman may see only furniture and shadow. Holmes, however, perceived the invisible disturbances in air, fibers, and habit, each as eloquent as spoken testimony. It was with this philosophy that we accompanied Inspector Lestrade to the first of the afflicted residences. The Bloomsbury house belonged to Professor Ellery Wainwright, a scholar of Oriental antiquities whose collapse had first drawn the Yard's attention. The dwelling stood in a dignified terrace of soot. Darkened brick, its brass knocker polished, its steps scrubbed to fastidious cleanliness. Within, the household moved with subdued anxiety, as though fearful that some unseen contagion lingered still. We were conducted to the professor's study. It was a long, high-ceilinged chamber, lined with dark walnut shelves burdened by folios and ancient volumes. Heavy burgundy curtains framed tall windows, now thrown open despite the chill. A coal fire had burned low in the grate, yet the air retained a peculiar sweetness, subtle but undeniable. Holmes paused upon the threshold. "Do not disturb the arrangement," he murmured. Lestrade, who had already begun to stride inward, halted with visible impatience. "You cannot expect the scent to remain after so many days," he protested. "We aired the place thoroughly." Holmes said nothing. He advanced slowly, as though entering a chapel. Removing one glove, he pressed his fingertips lightly against the curtain fabric, then raised them to his nose. He inhaled. I observed the faint narrowing of his eyes. "It lingers," he said quietly. Lestrade threw up his hands. "Naturally it lingers. You have told us as much about these base notes." Holmes shook his head. "It lingers beyond expectation." He drew back the curtain fully and examined the pleats. The fabric was thick and coarsely woven, an old-fashioned wool damask. "Amber resin," he murmured, "and the smoked vetiver beneath it. The floral note has largely dissipated. Only the foundation remains." He crossed next to the writing desk where Professor Wainwright had been found insensible. The blotter lay undisturbed. Papers were neatly stacked, a pen resting precisely in its tray. Holmes bent and inhaled again, this time near the carved wooden chair. "No concentration here," he observed. "The scent is strongest at the curtains." "Draft from the windows," I suggested. On the contrary, had the windows been open at the time, the fragrance would have dispersed more evenly. Lestrade frowned. "Then what do you infer?" Holmes turned, his expression thoughtful. "I infer that the source of the scent stood near the curtains for a measurable period. The second site lay in Kensington, at the residence of Captain Marcus Bellamy, retired of the Royal Navy. The house was smaller, though tastefully appointed. It was in a modest sitting room, less formal than the study at Bloomsbury, that the captain had collapsed. A woolen armchair stood near the hearth, its headrest slightly indented from habitual use. Holmes approached it with unmistakable intent. Again he removed his glove. Lestrade uttered a small exclamation of distaste as Holmes bent close and inhaled deeply along the upper edge of the chair. "Good heavens, Holmes." Holmes straightened, entirely unperturbed. "Strongest here," he said, at the headrest. "Which proves nothing," Lestrade insisted. "The captain might have worn the perfume himself. He does not," Holmes replied calmly. "I have already confirmed that he finds scented products objectionable." Lestrade blinked. "When did you confirm that?" "During our carriage ride," Holmes said mildly. "A brief inquiry through a mutual acquaintance." He brushed his gloved hand along the wool. "The coarseness of this fabric has absorbed the base notes with remarkable tenacity." "Tenacity you find suspicious?" I asked. "Exceedingly." He knelt beside the chair and examined the carpet beneath. No spillage, no dropped vial. The scent was borne upon a person. Lestrade crossed his arms. "Then that person sat here." "Not necessarily sat," Holmes replied. "Observe, the strongest concentration is upon the headrest alone, not the seat cushion, nor the arms." I leaned closer. Indeed, the faint fragrance seemed confined to that upper region. Holmes's eyes gleamed faintly. "One might lean over such a chair," he said softly. "One might speak to its occupant. One might incline one's head close to his." A silence fell. "You suggest," Lestrade said slowly, "that our visitor stood behind the captain." Holmes rose. "I suggest nothing, I merely observe." The third location proved the most curious of all. In Wapping, above a narrow frontage near the docks, Mr. Lionel Dacre, a shipping broker, had been found collapsed, not in a study nor a sitting room, but in a narrow hallway just within his private office. The corridor was cramped, its walls lined with pegs and a tall wooden coat stand. Holmes entered and paused at once. "Faint," he murmured. Even to my untrained senses, there was the barest whisper of sweetness in the air, less pronounced than at the previous scenes. He moved toward the coat stand. "No coat hung here when you arrived?" he asked. "None," Lestrade confirmed. The clerk swore the peg was empty. Holmes bent low and inhaled near the polished wood. "There," he said quietly. He ran a gloved hand along the peg itself. "The base note persists." "But how?" Lestrade demanded. "Can bare wood retain such fragrance after days?" Holmes did not answer at once. He stepped back and surveyed the narrow space. "In each case," he said at length, "the scent's presence contradicts the passage of time." I studied him. "Explain." He gestured toward the peg. "The volatile floral component should have evaporated within hours. The amber resin perhaps a day or two in an enclosed room. Yet here, despite ventilation and elapsed time, the base remains distinctly perceptible. You find that unnatural? I find it inconsistent." He returned to the coat stand and examined the lower portion. "Curious," he murmured. "What now?" Lestrade sighed. Holmes pointed to a faint smudge upon the wood. "Recently polished," he observed, "but not uniformly." Lestrade crouched. "What of it?" "If the peg had borne a coat," Holmes continued, "the cloth would have absorbed much of the fragrance. Instead, the wood itself has done so." "You believe the visitor removed his coat?" Holmes's gaze sharpened. "On the contrary, Inspector, I believe he wore it." The silence that followed was heavy. Holmes stood very still, as though listening once more to that inaudible internal melody. "It should have faded," he said quietly, brushing a gloved hand along the coarse wool of the hallway runner. "But it persists beyond its rightful hour." "You return always to that point," I observed, "because it is the fulcrum upon which this case turns." Lestrade gave a short laugh. "You astonish me, Holmes. You sniff curtains and chair backs and declare the matter nearly solved." Holmes's expression did not alter. "Rooms remember," he said calmly. "They remember in fibers and grains and drafts, And these rooms testify not merely to presence, but to duration. Duration, I repeated. Yes, in Bloomsbury, the scent clings strongest where one might stand beside the curtain, perhaps to obscure oneself from view of the street. In Kensington, it marks the headrest of a seated man, implying close proximity. And here in Wapping, it lingers upon a peg where a garment brushed briefly, yet sufficiently to leave its mark. Lestrade straightened slowly. You think the same individual visited all three? I think, Holmes replied, that the same garment did. A chill ran through me. You speak as though the coat itself were the culprit, Lestrade said dryly. Holmes's eyes flickered with faint amusement. Not the coat, Inspector, but what it carried. He moved toward the narrow window at the end of the hallway and examined its latch. Tell me, he said abruptly, were any of the victims robbed? Not a farthing. No documents missing. None reported. Holmes turned back, his expression grave. Then the purpose was neither theft nor violence. What then? I asked. Holmes's gaze drifted once more across the confined space. The rooms themselves suggest that time has been misjudged. In what sense? In the sense, my dear Watson, that the fragrance's persistence indicates a recent reintroduction. Lestrade stared. Reintroduction? You mean the culprit returned? Holmes's voice lowered. I mean that these scenes are not as temporally distant from one another as we suppose. The scent has been refreshed. A silence fell so complete that I could hear the faint murmur of dock workers below. You believe, Lestrade said slowly, that someone revisited the sites after the incidents. Holmes's eyes were distant now, calculating. Either revisited, or ensured that the source of the fragrance remained present. He drew on his gloves once more. The perfume's base is unusually tenacious upon coarse fabric, yet even so, it should not endure thus unless replenished. Lestrade exhaled sharply. You imply an audacity bordering on madness. Holmes's lips curved faintly. Madness is rarely so methodical. As we departed the Wapping office, I could not escape the sensation that we pursued not merely a man, but a design that extended beyond our present comprehension. The scent, elusive yet persistent, seemed less an accident than a deliberate thread woven through each chamber. The rooms had remembered, and in their memory lay the first true contradiction, a miscalculation of time itself. Holmes said little as we returned to Baker Street. Yet I observed the intensity in his gaze, and I knew that somewhere within the labyrinth of his mind the fragrance had begun to assume a shape more tangible than vapor. It was no longer merely a scent. It was a measure. Chapter 4 Fee, the alibis of gentlemen. Holmes has remarked more than once that the habits of the well-to-do are as predictable as the tides. Their manner may change with fashion, but their assumptions remain constant. That position is a shield, that reputation is proof, and that a gentleman's word, spoken calmly in a well-appointed room, possesses a kind of immunity against the vulgar scrutiny of facts. It was with this in mind that we undertook, on the following afternoon, to call upon the three men whose names had been so strangely entangled with our invisible signature. Velue's nocturne. Inspector Lestrade, ever mindful of propriety when it suited him, arranged our introductions with minimal disturbance. They are not common ruffians, he warned us as we rode. They'll complain to the commissioner if they feel harassed. Holmes's smile was faint. Then let them complain. The commissioner may learn something useful. Our first visit was to Mr. Adrian Blackwood of Kensington. His house stood in a quiet crescent, its FAA'd white stone and its iron railings immaculate. The butler who admitted us wore an expression of practiced reserve. Yet I caught the flicker of curiosity in his eyes when he observed Lestrade's presence. Mr. Blackwood received us in a drawing room rich with velvet and mahogany. He was a man in his early 40s, impeccably dressed despite the pallor of his cheeks. A silk shawl lay across his knees, and a medicine vial stood upon a nearby table. "Inspector Lestrade," he said coolly, "this is an unexpected honor." Lestrade cleared his throat. "Mr. Blackwood, I regret the intrusion. These gentlemen are Mr. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson." At the mention of Holmes's name, Blackwood's eyebrows lifted a fraction. I have heard of you, he said. I had not anticipated your interest in my affairs. Holmes inclined his head. Nor had I anticipated mine, Mr. Blackwood, until certain circumstances rendered it necessary. Blackwood's gaze hardened. What circumstances? Holmes's tone remained conversational. A fragrance. A brief stillness. Blackwood's hand tightened upon the armrest, then relaxed. Ah, he said. You refer to my perfume. Yes, I possess a bottle of an exclusive composition. I fail to see what relevance that might have to Scotland Yard. Holmes's eyes wandered, seemingly idly, across the room. They paused upon the mantelpiece, the heavy curtains, the polished brass of the fireguard. Then, with disarming politeness, he looked back at our host. You have been unwell, he observed. Blackwood's expression grew faintly offended. I beg your pardon. You have been confined indoors these past nights, I believe. I have, Blackwood replied curtly. Influenza. My physician insisted upon rest. Holmes's gaze flicked briefly to Blackwood's cuffs, starched linen immaculate, then to the collar of his shirt. Then, in a movement so subtle, I might have missed it had I not known his methods, to the faint dampness upon the man's hairline. Your servants confirm, Lestrade said, producing a notebook. You did not leave the premises on the evenings in question. My servants would have no choice but to confirm, Blackwood replied. They watched me as though I were a child. I could scarcely rise from bed. Holmes stepped closer to the small table and lifted the medicine vial between his fingers. Camphorated spirits, he remarked, and quinine sensible. Blackwood's eyes narrowed. You are a doctor? No, Holmes said, merely observant. I could not help noting that although Mr. Blackwood spoke with composed indignation, there was an undercurrent of tension beneath his civility, an awareness that he stood in a contest of perception. Holmes thanked him courteously, asked one or two innocuous questions about his household routine, and withdrew. In the street, Lestrade muttered, Well, he looks half dead. If he is our man, then I am the king of Bohemia. Holmes's reply was quiet. Illness may confine a body, Inspector. It does not always confine influence. We next called upon Mr. Charles Harrow in Bloomsbury. Harrow's residence was of an older style, crowded between bookshops and modest private clubs. Inside, the house smelled faintly of dust and old paper. We were shown to a study that seemed a smaller echo of Professor Wainwright's books, crowded every surface, manuscripts stacked like miniature towers. Mr. Harrow rose to greet us, a tall, spare gentleman with a scholar's stoop and a scholar's sharp eyes. His hair was graying at the temples, his mouth set in a line of habitual skepticism. Holmes, he said, with a nod that suggested both respect and reluctance. To what do I owe this? Academic visitation. Holmes returned the nod. To a matter that concerns, among other things, the ownership of a rare perfume. Harrow's lips curled slightly. A frivolous object to occupy serious minds. And yet, Holmes replied, it has drifted into serious places. Harrow sighed. Very well, yes. I purchased Velleur's Nocturne some months ago as an indulgence, but I have scarcely used it. I prefer the clean simplicity of soap. Lestrade pressed him. Where were you on the nights of the incidents? In my rooms, Harrow replied without hesitation, reading correspondence, letters from colleagues in Oxford and Cairo. My valet can attest to it. The valet summoned at once swore solemnly that his master had not left the house. He described, with the earnest detail of a man certain that truth lay in precision, the times at which he had brought tea, extinguished lamps, and collected the letter tray. Holmes listened with mild interest, yet his eyes, I noticed, were fixed not upon the valet's face, but upon Harrow's scarf. Dark wool, loosely knotted. He also observed Harrow's hands, long, fingered, ink, stained, yet scrubbed with unusual thoroughness. Holmes asked Harrow about his correspondence, about the nature of his work, about his acquaintances in learned society. The scholar answered readily, even eagerly. as though grateful for a subject more respectable than perfume and police inquiry. Yet there were moments, small hesitations, a tightening at the corners of his eyes, when he seemed to measure his words more carefully. When we withdrew, Harrow's parting remark followed us like a thrown pebble. "I trust, Inspector, that Scotland Yard has not sunk so low as to hunt gentlemen for their choice of scent." Lestrade flushed. Holmes only smiled. Our third call brought us to Hampstead, to Mr. Edwin Crowley. Crowley's house stood amid trees and sloping gardens, away from the densest fog. Yet even there, the air carried London's damp breath. The house was large, though less ostentatious than Blackwood's, more the retreat of a man who values privacy above display. Crowley received us in a conservatory filled with winter greenery. He was a handsome man, perhaps in his late 30s, with the easy poise of one accustomed to admiration. His voice was smooth, his manner agreeable, but beneath it I sensed a watchfulness. "Mr. Holmes," he said warmly, "I have long wondered whether our paths might cross, though I confess I did not expect to meet you under such circumstances." Holmes returned his courtesy. "Circumstances have a habit of arranging introductions." Crowley smiled. "So I have heard. And what circumstance brings you, Inspector Lestrade, to my garden?" Lestrade explained briefly. Crowley listened, without visible concern. "And you wish to know whether I left my property on certain evenings?" he said. "I did not. I have been enjoying the quiet of my grounds. My neighbors may tell you they glimpsed me by lamplight near the hedge." Indeed, when Lestrade later spoke with two neighboring householders, they confirmed that Crowley had been seen strolling in his garden, a lantern in hand, at roughly the relevant hours. Crowley leaned back in his chair. "You see, a simple matter. I do not know your victims, and I have no interest in docks, scholars, or naval officers." Holmes, who had thus far spoken little, suddenly asked, "Do you hunt, Mr. Crowley?" Crowley blinked. "Occasionally." "And you keep dogs?" "A few," Crowley replied, gesturing vaguely toward the rear grounds. Holmes's gaze drifted to Crowley's collar. The man wore a dark cravat secured with a small pin. There was no overt scent about him that I could detect, only the faintly clean smell of soap and winter air. Holmes inclined his head. "Thank you. I have no more questions at present." Crowley's smile remained, yet his eyes narrowed a fraction. "Then I trust we are finished, for the moment," Holmes replied. We returned to Baker Street as dusk fell, London's lamps glowing like pale embers in the fog. Lestrade, though outwardly satisfied by the uniformity of the gentleman's composure, could not entirely conceal his frustration. "Well?" he demanded once we were back in our sitting room. 3 respectable men, 3 solid alibis. Not one of them reeks of your precious perfume. Where does that leave us? Holmes did not answer immediately. He stood by the fire, hands clasped behind his back, gaze fixed upon the dancing flames. Each man appeared composed, he said at last, even faintly indignant at suspicion. Exactly as expected. Lestrade snorted. "Because they are innocent." Holmes turned, and for a moment his expression was almost severe. "Inspector," he said quietly, "innocence is not proven by indignation." He crossed to the table where I had set down our notes. He opened his pocket, case, and withdrew a small strip of cloth, dark and coarse. "What is that?" I asked. "A thread," Holmes replied, "from Mr. Harrow's scarf. It caught upon the chair arm when he rose." "You took it," Lestrade exclaimed. Holmes regarded him blandly. "It detached itself. I merely prevented it from falling." He held it closer to the lamp, and then, to my astonishment, brought it briefly to his nose. Lestrade groaned. "Not again." Holmes ignored him. "No scent," he murmured. "You see," Lestrade cried triumphantly. "No scent." Holmes's eyes remained thoughtful. "The absence is what speaks," he said. I frowned. "How so?" Holmes seated himself at last, steepling his fingers. "A man who purchases Villara's Nocturne does not do so for subtlety. He does not pay Rourke's extravagant price merely to let the bottle gather dust." "But Mr. Harrow claimed he scarcely used it," I said. And Mr. Blackwood implied he wore it sparingly, Holmes added. Mr. Crowley spoke of it as one speaks of any ordinary indulgence, without enthusiasm, without attachment. Yet all three sought exclusivity, and exclusivity is rarely the pursuit of the indifferent. Lestrade's brows knit. You suggest they lied about using it. I suggest, Holmes replied, that one of them used it, and then ceased abruptly. He rose and crossed to the washstand, where a basin and towel were kept for daily use. He lifted the towel and held it up to the light. Observe, Watson, soap removes dirt. But to remove scent from the skin and collar, particularly such a tenacious base, one must wash thoroughly, repeatedly, often with harsh spirits. It leaves signs. What signs? I asked. Holmes's eyes flickered with satisfaction. Rawness about the collar line, dampness in the hair from a recent vigorous scrub, cuffs too immaculate for a man supposedly confined to bed. A scarf washed so often, its fibers begin to fray. Lestrade stared. You noticed all that? Holmes's smile was thin. It is my profession. I recalled then Mr. Blackwood's faint dampness at the hairline, his cuffs unnaturally pristine. I recalled Harrow's hands, scrubbed beyond the usual cleanliness of a scholar, and the slight worn edge of his scarf, as though laundered too frequently. And Crowley. Crowley had seemed the freshest of all, clean as winter air, with not even the faintest lingering note of indulgence. Holmes resumed his pacing. A man who wears such a fragrance does not abandon it abruptly, he said, unless he has reason to wash it away. Lestrade rubbed his brow. You're saying one of them has been scrubbing himself like a dockhand to remove perfume. I am saying, Holmes corrected, that someone associated with one of them has taken pains to erase the trace. And yet the scent appears at the scenes, I said. If it were erased, how could it betray him? Holmes stopped, and his eyes gleamed with that peculiar intensity that always foretold some shift in the investigation. Because, he said softly, erasure is seldom perfect. It removes the obvious, not the subtle, and a man may wash his skin. But what of the coat he wore? What of the scarf he wrapped? What of the wool that absorbed the base notes and refused to release them? He turned toward the window, where the fog pressed close, like a listening creature. Tomorrow, he said, we shall look not at what these gentlemen said, but at what their households forgot to conceal. Lestrade stiffened. You mean their servants? Holmes nodded. Servants are the nerves of a house, he said. They feel every movement, however small, and unlike gentlemen, they do not always understand which details matter. He reached for his hat. There is one further point, he added. What is it? I asked. Holmes's expression grew grave. Crowley's neighbors saw him in his garden by lamplight, he said. A neat alibi. Too neat. A glimpse is not proof of presence. It is only proof that someone wished to be seen. Lestrade opened his mouth to protest, then closed it again. Holmes's gaze returned to the fire. The scent brought us to gentlemen, he said. But gentlemen may be merely the visible crest of a deeper current. Outside, the lamps burned dimly in the fog, and somewhere in London a fragrance, rare, deliberate, and stubborn, waited to betray the next misjudgment. Chapter V. The gathering recalled. It is one of the peculiarities of London society that its most consequential events are seldom recorded upon paper. Contracts may be signed and fortunes sealed in ink, but reputations, alliances, and enmities are forged in drawing rooms, beneath chandeliers, amid the clink of crystal, and under the influence of generous wine. Such occasions leave little documentary trace. They survive only in recollection, which is to say, in distortion. The detail emerged not through Lestrade's official channels, but by one of those quiet inquiries Holmes so deftly conducts when he wishes to avoid alarming the very persons he studies. A discreet visit to a club steward, a brief exchange with a milliner's assistant who dressed a certain lady for a winter reception. A word here, a suggestion there. By such threads Holmes assembled the outline of an evening which, until then, had been little more than social gossip. Some weeks prior to the incidents, Mr. Adrian Blackwood, Mr. Charles Harrow, and Mr. Edwin Crowley had attended a private gathering at the townhouse of Lady Eleanor Winfield. No written invitations? I asked as Holmes related this to me over breakfast. None that remain, he replied. Lady Winfield is said to favor spontaneity. The guest list exists only in memory, and memory, as we know, is notoriously accommodating. Lady Winfield's residence stood in Belgravia, a tall, dignified structure of pale stone with tall windows and a discreet brass plaque. She was a widow of independent means, known for her beauty, her wit, and her selective hospitality. Her salons were intimate affairs. No more than a dozen guests at a time, drawn from that delicate intersection of wealth, intellect, and ambition which defines a certain stratum of London society. Holmes did not seek an immediate audience with her. Instead, he gathered impressions from those who had served that evening, a footman now employed elsewhere, a violinist who had provided discreet music in the adjoining room, even a wine merchant who remembered delivering a particularly fine claret to the house on that date. From these fragments, a picture emerged. Wine flowed generously, Holmes told me. Conversation grew animated, and toward midnight, voices were raised. Between whom? I asked. Between Blackwood and Harrow, principally. Crowley, it appears, intervened, though whether as mediator or antagonist is unclear. And the subject? Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. A railway investment, a proposed expansion line into the Midlands. Considerable sums were at stake. I whistled softly. And jealousy, you said. Holmes inclined his head. It is whispered, he said, that Lady Winfield herself was the object of attentions from more than one quarter. I could not suppress a smile. Then the evening possessed all the necessary ingredients for discord: money, ambition, and a lady of charm. Holmes's expression remained grave. Resentment, Watson, is the most persistent of human emotions. It outlives intoxication. It survives reconciliation. We determined at last to call upon Lady Winfield herself. She received us in a drawing room of refined elegance. Pale walls, gilt mirrors, and arrangements of winter roses lent the space an air of cultivated serenity. Lady Winfield was perhaps in her early 30s, with dark hair arranged in an artful simplicity that only careful effort can achieve. Her eyes were intelligent, more observant than she perhaps intended to reveal. Mr. Holmes, she said, inclining her head. I had not expected my modest gatherings to attract the attention of Baker Street. Madam, Holmes replied with equal courtesy, it is precisely their modesty that renders them interesting. She smiled faintly. You refer to that unfortunate dispute. I refer, Holmes said gently, to an evening at which 3 gentlemen now of some interest to us were present. She hesitated only briefly. Yes, she said. Mr. Blackwood, Mr. Harrow, and Mr. Crowley attended. And the atmosphere? Lively, she replied, until it was not. Holmes did not interrupt. He allowed silence to do its work. At first, she continued, the conversation concerned business. Mr. Blackwood had spoken enthusiastically of a railway opportunity. Mr. Harrow expressed skepticism regarding its viability. Mr. Crowley, she paused. Yes, Holmes prompted softly. Mr. Crowley suggested that Mr. Blackwood's optimism might be self-serving, and this displeased him considerably. She moved toward the mantel, adjusting a porcelain figurine with unnecessary precision. Voices rose. Accusations of withheld information were made. I regret to say that the tone grew ungentlemanly. And afterward, Holmes asked. They apologized, of course, at least outwardly. Outward reconciliation, Holmes murmured. Lady Winfield's gaze flickered toward him, as though she sensed the depth of his inquiry. You must understand, she said carefully, that such tensions are not uncommon where large investments are concerned. And yet, Holmes replied, there was another element. Her eyes sharpened. What do you mean? Holmes's voice remained mild. It has been suggested that more than financial interests were at play. A faint color rose to her cheeks. I do not encourage rivalry, she said coolly. Of course not, but men are competitive, she conceded. And on that evening, Holmes continued, all three gentlemen wore the same distinctive fragrance. She looked momentarily surprised. Yes, she said slowly. It was remarked upon. The room was quite saturated with it. I recall jesting that I could not distinguish one from another by scent alone. Holmes's eyes gleamed faintly. The drawing room must have been heavy with it. Indeed, she replied. It lingered long after the guests departed. Holmes inclined his head in thanks. One final question. Lady Winfield, after that evening, did relations among the three remain cordial? She hesitated. They continued to attend my gatherings, she said at last, but there was a coolness, a calculation. Holmes rose. You have been most helpful. As we took our leave, I sensed that she watched Holmes with a mixture of curiosity and unease, as though she perceived that he had drawn from her words more than she had consciously offered. Back in our carriage, I turned to him. You believe the quarrel significant? Holmes clasped his hands lightly. Memory is an unreliable witness, he said. Yet resentment endures with admirable clarity. You think the dispute over the railway led to the incidents? Perhaps. Or perhaps the railway is but the visible surface of a deeper motive. And Lady Winfield? Holmes's expression grew thoughtful. A catalyst, he said. Nothing more. But what of the scent? I pressed. Surely it is coincidence that all three wore it that night. Holmes shook his head. Coincidence is merely a word we employ when we have not yet discerned the pattern. He leaned back, eyes half closed. Imagine the scene, Watson. A confined drawing room, three men wearing a fragrance whose base notes are unusually tenacious. The air grows dense with amber and vetiver. Fabric absorbs it. Coats, scarves, upholstery, all steeped in the same aroma. I nodded slowly. And afterward, Holmes continued, each man returns home. The scent clings to his garments. It seeps into wardrobes. It transfers to chairs, to curtains. Then weeks later, I said, following his reasoning, the same scent appears at three separate scenes of sudden collapse. Precisely. But how does that connect? Holmes's eyes opened fully now. That shared cloud of scent is not merely atmospheric recollection. It is a baseline. A baseline. Yes, each gentleman became, for that evening, indistinguishable by smell. If one wished later to introduce that same fragrance into another room, suspicion would fall equally upon all three. I stared at him. You mean the perfume serves as a deliberate misdirection? Holmes nodded. A signature that implicates three instead of one. And the quarrel? Holmes's gaze grew distant. A quarrel establishes motive, financial, emotional, or both. If one of them felt betrayed, either in business or in affection, resentment might ripen into something darker. But the victims, the scholar, the naval officer, the broker, what have they to do with a railway investment? Holmes rose abruptly and crossed to the map he had pinned upon the wall. Three small marks indicated Bloomsbury, Kensington, and Wapping. Railway expansion, he said quietly. Requires land, contracts, shipping arrangements, academic endorsements. He tapped Bloomsbury. Professor Wainwright advised on antiquities, perhaps consulted regarding land surveys. He tapped Kensington. Captain Bellamy, naval connections, influence in maritime logistics. Then Wapping, Mr. Dacre, shipping broker. He would facilitate materials transport. A silence fell. You believe, I said slowly, that each victim was connected to the railway scheme. I believe it is a possibility that merits examination. And their collapse, Holmes's voice was low. A warning. A warning against what? Against interference, he replied. He turned back to the fire, his profile stark in the lamplight. Consider this. If one of the three gentlemen sought sole control of the investment, or revenge for a perceived slight, he might wish to silence certain advisors without resorting to overt violence. And the perfume? I asked. Holmes's lips curved faintly. A theatrical flourish, or a calculated attempt to disperse suspicion. I felt a shiver, unrelated to the winter air. You are certain it was at that gathering that the plan began? Holmes regarded me steadily. I am certain of nothing yet, he said. But that evening bound the three men together, in scent, in dispute, and in memory. And memory, however unreliable, leaves traces. He moved toward the window, gazing out at the fog, softened lamps of Baker Street. In that drawing room, he murmured. They stood beneath the same cloud of fragrance. Weeks later, that same cloud drifts through studies and corridors where men fall insensible. He turned back to me, eyes bright with the cold fire of deduction. It is not merely perfume we pursue, Watson. It is the echo of a shared moment, one in which ambition soured. Outside, the fog thickened once more, as though determined to conceal the truth a little longer. Yet Holmes, I knew, had fixed upon that shared cloud of scent as a thread, fine, intangible, yet unbreakable, and he meant to follow it wherever it led. Chapter V, fee-based notes, and wool, the fog that had so persistently cloaked London seemed, at last, to recede for a day, granting us a pale and wintry sun. Holmes, however, appeared scarcely aware of the improvement in weather. His mind had retreated inward once more, into that austere laboratory of deduction from which, in due course, conclusions would emerge with startling clarity. He had secured, by means not entirely disclosed to Lestrade, a minute sample of Valeur's Nocturne from Mr. Matthias Rourke's remaining stock of raw ingredients. The chemist, though adamant that no full bottle remained, had conceded that a trace of the base compound lingered in a storage vial, sufficient for analysis, though not for sale. Holmes treated the substance with the reverence of a rare toxin. "You perceive, Watson," he said, as he decanted a scarcely visible drop onto a glass rod, "that we are concerned not merely with fragrance, but with behavior." "Behavior," I echoed. "The behavior of matter under given conditions. A scent is as obedient to chemical law as any acid or alkaloid." He had arranged upon the table several strips of wool, some coarse, some fine, alongside cotton, linen, and a small swatch of silk. Each bore a discrete pencil mark for identification. With meticulous care, he applied to each a trace of the perfume's base, then set them aside beneath varying conditions. One strip he placed upon the mantel, exposed to the open air of the room. Another he suspended from the window latch, allowing the winter breeze to pass over it. A third he laid upon the hearthstone, where warmth from the fire would act upon it. Yet another he exposed deliberately to tobacco smoke, holding it above the curling plume of his pipe. "Surely," I ventured, "you do not expect the perfume to survive such indignities?" Holmes smiled faintly. "That, my dear Watson, is precisely what I intend to determine." Over the course of the next 48 hours, he examined the samples at regular intervals. The lighter floral note, the elusive eastern blossom of which Rourke had spoken, faded almost entirely within a few hours, as Holmes had predicted. By the second day, it was scarcely perceptible upon any fabric, but the base notes told a different story. He lifted the strip of coarse wool that had hung in the open air and held it near the lamp. "Inhale," he instructed. I obeyed. There it was again, that faint yet unmistakable richness of amber resin, underpinned by the smoky depth of vetiver. "Remarkable," I said. "It endures." Holmes nodded. "The perfume bonds to lanolin," he explained. "Wool, as you know, retains a natural oil. The resinous components of the fragrance settle into it, bind with it, and release only gradually when warmed or agitated." He held the strip closer to the fire, then passed it to me once more. The scent intensified almost immediately. "You see," he said, "it lies dormant until stimulated." "And on cotton?" I asked. He handed me another sample. The aroma was faint, nearly absent. "Cotton absorbs less readily," he observed. "Linen scarcely at all. Silk, though it may retain the top notes briefly, does not hold the base." He set the wool aside and leaned back. Thus, a scarf or overcoat of wool could carry the scent long after the wearer believed it gone. I considered the implications. "If one of our three gentlemen attended each scene clad in wool," I said slowly, "the fragrance would testify silently against him." Holmes's eyes gleamed with approval. "Precisely. a coat worn into Professor Wainwright's study, a scarf draped behind Captain Bellamy's chair, an overcoat brushed against a peg in Mr. Dacre's hallway. But would not the wearer himself notice? I asked. Surely such a scent, however diminished, must cling to his senses. Holmes shook his head. The human nose fatigues quickly to familiar stimuli. A man accustomed to a fragrance ceases to perceive it. It becomes part of his personal atmosphere. And if he later attempted to wash it away? Holmes rose and crossed to the washstand. He dipped a cloth into a basin of water mixed with a small quantity of spirits and rubbed vigorously at one of the treated wool strips. "Observe," he said after a moment. I inhaled again. Though diminished, the scent remained. "It can be masked," Holmes continued, "but not wholly eradicated, particularly in coarse weave." He turned the strip over in his fingers, examining the fibers beneath the lens of his magnifying glass. "Furthermore," he added, "vigorous washing leaves its own evidence. Lanolin is stripped. The fabric grows dry, harsh to the touch." I recalled at once the slightly abraded edge of Mr. Harrow's scarf, the unusual freshness of Mr. Blackwood's cuffs. "You suspect," I said, "that one of them has attempted precisely that?" Holmes did not answer directly. Instead, he approached the window and laid another strip of wool upon the exterior ledge, allowing the faint drizzle that had begun to fall to soak into it. "Rain," he said quietly, "is no remedy. Pause later. Once dried, the wool retained its faint but distinct base." Holmes regarded it with satisfaction. "The perfume's persistence exceeds ordinary projection," he said. "It is designed for longevity, and therefore for memory," I suggested. He inclined his head. "Just so." That evening, Inspector Lestrade returned, bearing additional reports. "We've confirmed," he announced, "that Professor Wainwright had recently declined to endorse a railway expansion proposal, claimed it endangered certain archaeological sites." Holmes's eyes brightened. "And Captain Bellamy refused to guarantee shipping contracts without revised terms. And Mr. Dacre," Lestrade's mouth tightened, "was considering a competing arrangement." Holmes folded his hands. "Then our theory of financial motive strengthens, but we still lack proof," Lestrade insisted. "No one saw any of the three gentlemen at the scenes." Holmes gestured toward the wool samples. "They were seen," he said quietly, "only not by eyes." Lestrade frowned. "The rooms remember," Holmes continued. "They remember in fiber and grain. The scent upon the curtains, the headrest, the peg, each tells of proximity, of duration." "Duration again," Lestrade muttered. "Yes," Holmes replied. "Not a fleeting visit, but sufficient time for heat and motion to awaken the base notes." He paced slowly. "If one of the gentlemen attended each crime scene clad in wool, the fragrance would testify silently against him. The question remains, which scarf and whose wardrobe concealed the truth?" Lestrade crossed his arms. "You propose we search their closets?" Holmes's expression grew thoughtful. "Not directly. A gentleman of means would object, and perhaps take measures to remove what we seek." "Then how?" Holmes stopped beside the hearth and regarded the glowing coals. "We must contrive to observe their garments under natural conditions." "Natural warmth," Holmes said softly. "Conversation, proximity to fire." I began to understand. "You mean to invite them here?" Holmes's lips curved in a thin smile. "Precisely." Lestrade looked alarmed. "All three at once," Holmes nodded. "Under some plausible pretext. A discussion of the railway investment, perhaps, or a mutual concern regarding the investigation. And you believe the scent will reveal itself?" Holmes turned, eyes alight with cold anticipation. "When wool warmed by a hearth releases what it has concealed," he said, "even the most fastidious gentleman may betray himself." The idea, at once audacious and deceptively simple, sent a tremor of expectation through me. Outside, rain fell softly upon Baker Street, tapping against the glass like impatient fingers. Within, the faint aroma from Holmes's experimental strips lingered still, a ghost of amber and smoke. If the culprit believed the perfume long washed away, he would soon learn that base notes, like resentment, do not surrender easily. And in the quiet fibers of wool, truth waited. Chapter 7. Fear Wardrobe's Secret Holmes has often maintained that the most direct path to truth is seldom the most obvious. A locked drawer invites resistance. A courteous request, artfully framed, often opens far more doors. It was therefore with an air of scholarly detachment that he composed a brief circular, printed on respectable paper and bearing the title of a proposed monograph, on the influence of imported Eastern oils upon English woolens. I trust, I remarked, as I read the draft, that no such treatise exists. It does not, Holmes replied calmly. But it might, and that possibility will suffice. Inspector Lestrade, though initially skeptical, conceded that a voluntary inspection conducted under academic pretense would provoke less alarm than a warrant. Thus, within 2 days, Holmes secured the reluctant consent of our 3 gentlemen to examine certain garments, ostensibly for scientific curiosity regarding the interaction of rare oils and British fabrics. I detest deception in matters of honor, Lestrade muttered as we set out for Kensington once more. Holmes adjusted his gloves. We seek truth, Inspector. Deception is already at work. We merely follow its thread. Mr. Blackwood's closet. Mr. Adrian Blackwood received us with polite fatigue. His complexion appeared improved since our last visit, though he retained the air of a convalescent keen to demonstrate his recovery. You require access to my wardrobe, he inquired, faint amusement touching his tone. For science, for observation. Holmes corrected gently. Blackwood's dressing room was spacious and meticulously arranged. Coats hung equidistant, their shoulders perfectly aligned. Cedar blocks rested discreetly between garments, lending the air a dry, woody scent. Holmes moved along the row without haste. He did not sniff openly as Lestrade had feared. Instead, he brushed his gloved fingertips lightly along cuffs and collars, occasionally lifting a sleeve nearer to the light. Blackwood watched with folded arms. You will find nothing extraordinary, he said. My valet sees to that. Holmes nodded. Indeed, your garments are well aired. He paused briefly at a dark overcoat of fine wool. I observed the slightest narrowing of his eyes, but when he lowered the fabric, his expression had resumed its habitual composure. Have you worn this recently? Holmes asked. Not since the weather turned milder, Blackwood replied. Perhaps a fortnight ago. Holmes inclined his head and continued. After several minutes, he stepped back. Impeccable care, he observed. You are to be congratulated. Blackwood smiled faintly. I prefer order. As we withdrew, Lestrade whispered, Well, Holmes's voice was neutral. Order can conceal much, he said. But in this case, I detect nothing conclusive. I noted, however, that he did not say nothing at all. Mr. Harrow's wardrobe Bloomsbury presented a different atmosphere. Mr. Charles Harrow, though civil, regarded our request with visible irritation. I trust this will be brief, he said. My time is not without value. His wardrobe proved less expansive than Blackwood's, yet equally tidy. Books occupied even this private chamber, stacked upon a side table beside neatly folded garments. Holmes proceeded methodically. His touch lingered longer here, particularly upon scarves draped over a wooden rail. At last, he lifted a heavy winter scarf, dark wool, thickly woven. May I? He asked. Harrow shrugged. If you must, I have not worn that in weeks. Holmes held it lightly, then passed it to me without comment. I inhaled cautiously. There it was, a faint whisper of amber and smoke, so subtle that one might dismiss it as imagination, yet unmistakable once recognized. Holmes's gaze flickered toward me, confirming that he too had perceived it. You are certain it has not been worn recently? He asked mildly. Quite certain, Harrow replied. The weather has not required it. Holmes examined the edge of the scarf beneath his lens. The fibers show recent agitation, he remarked. Perhaps from washing. Harrow stiffened slightly. My valet cleans my garments as needed. Of course, Holmes said softly. He replaced the scarf precisely as he had found it. As we descended the stairs, Lestrade leaned close. You found something. Holmes's expression was unreadable. Mr. Crowley's wardrobe. It was in Hampstead that the investigation altered in tone. Mr. Edwin Crowley received us with his customary ease, though I fancied there was an undercurrent of impatience in his manner. Another inspection, he said lightly. You are thorough, Mr. Holmes. Thoroughness is a virtue, Holmes replied. Crowley's dressing room lay adjacent to his bedchamber, overlooking the garden. The space bore the faint scent of Polish and cold air. Coats hung in ordered ranks. Boots stood aligned beneath them. Holmes began as before, calm, unhurried, apparently detached. Yet I knew him well enough to recognize the heightened alertness in his posture. He examined a series of dark overcoats, then a lighter tweed jacket, then a hunting cloak. Nothing. He moved to a lower shelf where scarves were folded. The first yielded no trace. The second, a lighter weave, was scentless. Then his hand paused. Behind a row of neatly arranged coats, partially concealed and folded with less precision than the rest, lay a dark wool scarf of heavier texture. Holmes withdrew it carefully. I saw at once that its folds were uneven, as though replaced hastily. Crowley's expression did not change, but his eyes sharpened. That, he said, an old thing. I had forgotten it. Holmes lifted the fabric toward the light. He did not bring it openly to his nose. Instead, he held it near the warmth of the lamp. Within seconds, the air about us shifted. Even Lestrade, who possessed little patience for olfactory subtleties, drew in a breath. There, he said involuntarily. The perfume's base, amber and smoked vetiver, rose with unmistakable clarity. Not faint, not residual. Present. Holmes lowered the scarf slowly. You mentioned, he said evenly, that you have not left your property on the evenings in question. That is correct, Crowley replied, his tone steady. And this scarf? I have not worn it in weeks. Holmes regarded him for a long moment. The lanolin is undisturbed, he said softly. The fibers retain moisture from recent exposure. It has been worn. Crowley's smile thinned. You presume much from scent. Holmes folded the scarf carefully. On the contrary, he replied, scent presumes much from wool. A silence fell. Tense, brittle Lestrade cleared his throat. Mr. Crowley, would you care to revise your statement? Crowley's gaze moved from Lestrade to Holmes. I have nothing to revise. Holmes said nothing further. He replaced the scarf precisely where he had found it. As we took our leave, I saw that his eyes shone. Not with triumph, but with quiet confirmation. Baker Street, the quiet conclusion back at Baker Street. Lestrade burst forth at once. That scarf reeks of your infernal perfume. Why did you not confront him outright? Holmes removed his gloves deliberately. Because accusation without full chain of proof invites denial, he said. And denial would grant him time. Time for what? To destroy what remains. He crossed to the hearth and stood gazing into the fire. The scarf was folded hastily. It lay behind the others, not among them. Its scent is stronger than that, found in Harrow's garment, stronger even than Blackwood's overcoat. Then it is he, Lestrade exclaimed. Holmes raised a hand. Patience, the scarf tells us that Crowley has worn Velleur's nocturne recently, far more recently than he admits. And he claimed confinement to his garden, I said. Indeed. Holmes turned toward us. Consider the pattern. 3 victims connected to a railway enterprise, a quarrel at Lady Winfield's gathering, financial rivalry, romantic tension, and now a garment that contradicts its owner's alibi. Lestrade's face hardened. You believe Crowley visited each victim? I believe, Holmes said quietly, that his wool bore witness. He stepped closer to the fire, warming his hands. When heated, the scarf released its concealed base with unnatural strength. It has not merely absorbed residual atmosphere, it has been immersed in it. You mean he wore it at Lady Winfield's gathering, I said. And afterward, Holmes added softly. The room grew very still. If Crowley attended each crime scene clad in that scarf, I ventured, the fragrance would cling to curtains, to chairs, to pegs, exactly as we observed. Holmes inclined his head, and believing the scent long faded, he concealed the garment rather than destroying it, perhaps from vanity, perhaps from oversight. Lestrade's jaw tightened. Then tomorrow. Tomorrow. Holmes interrupted gently. We verify the final link. And what link is that? I asked. Holmes's eyes gleamed in the firelight. The method by which our victims were rendered insensible. He turned once more toward the flames, his profile sharp and resolute. The wardrobe has spoken, he said softly. Now we must compel the man himself to do the same. Outside, Hampstead lay quiet beneath the winter sky. Yet somewhere within that ordered house, a dark wool scarf whispered of places its owner denied visiting. And Holmes, who had heard that whisper, was already preparing to make it thunder. Chapter the 8th. Fee words spoken in jealousy. Holmes has always held that the most dangerous lies are those spoken in drawing rooms. In darker quarters of London, men resort to knives and pistols. Among the genteel, they employ insinuation, reputation, and when pressed, quiet methods that leave no blood upon the carpet. Yet the passions that drive both classes are identical: pride, greed, jealousy. These require no rough upbringing to flourish. In the days that followed our visit to Crowley's house, Holmes devoted himself to reconstructing the quarrel at Lady Winfield's gathering as a chemist might reconstruct an unseen reaction from its residue. No single witness possessed a complete account. There were only fragments, half-remembered sentences, a servant's impression of raised voices, a musician's recollection of abrupt silence, a lady's description of a chill in the air. Holmes gathered them all, arranged them, and from their interlocking edges fashioned a scene vivid enough that I felt I had stood within that Belgravia drawing room myself. Memory is partial, he told me, spreading his notes across the table. But emotion leaves a sharper imprint than fact. When men are wounded in pride, their words are remembered, even if their logic is not. He began with the most dependable witness of all, not a person, but circumstance. Lady Winfield had confirmed that the room had been saturated with Velleurs Nocturne. That was no trifling detail. It meant that the three men had not merely owned the perfume, they had worn it openly, almost competitively, as though each sought to claim the same exclusivity and yet outshine the others within it. In that room, Holmes said, they were indistinguishable by scent. That is vital. Vital in what way? I asked. Because when a man later carries the same fragrance into another house, suspicion may be divided among all who wore it at the source. He spoke as if scent were a mathematical variable. Yet the human element, jealousy, was equally precise in his mind. Holmes had arranged, by means both discreet and relentless, to speak with two individuals who had been present at Lady Winfield's gathering: Lady Winfield's cousin, Miss Adelaide Pritchard, and Mr. St. Clair Devon, a young barrister whose tongue, it appeared, loosened readily under the influence of Holmes's mild encouragement and a glass of claret. From Miss Pritchard, Holmes obtained propriety, what could be admitted without scandal. From Devon he obtained what propriety attempted to conceal. Crowley was the spark, Devon said, leaning forward with eager gossip. Always was. The man cannot bear to be contradicted. And what contradiction? Holmes asked. Provoked him. Devon shrugged. Railway shares, some land option, I believe. Harrow had been entrusted with certain documents. He has connections in government circles, Crowley thought. He'd been misled or cut out. Holmes's eyes narrowed, and Blackwood. Blackwood tried to smooth it over, played the gentleman mediator. But you know how it goes. Two dogs fighting, and a third barking for peace only gets bitten. Miss Pritchard had expressed it differently. Mr. Crowley grew very heated, she said. He spoke of betrayal. Mr. Harrow was quiet at first, almost cold. Mr. Blackwood begged them to remember they were friends. Holmes had obtained from Lady Winfield herself a more personal fragment, one she had tried to dismiss as unimportant. Mr. Crowley said something, she admitted reluctantly. About being robbed twice in one evening. I assumed he meant money. Holmes, when she said it, had merely bowed. But when he repeated it to me later, his expression was grave. Twice, he murmured. Financial slight and romantic disappointment. I could not help recalling the faint flush upon Lady Winfield's cheeks when Holmes had broached the subject. She had not spoken of affection outright, but her silence had done so. Holmes laid his notes in order. Thus, he said, the quarrel took this course. Crowley accused Harrow of deception in the joint railway scheme. Harrow, proud and intellectual, replied with disdain, perhaps even with cutting truth. Blackwood attempted uneasy mediation, likely because he benefited from both men remaining engaged in the venture. And Crowley's pride suffered, I said. Holmes nodded. Crowley's pride suffered, and pride, when injured, seeks repair. Lestrade arrived that afternoon, bristling with impatience. You've been talking to ladies and clubmen while I've been running after ledgers, he complained. Have you got anything solid? Holmes held up a sheet of paper. A list of confrontations, he said simply. Lestrade frowned. Confrontations? Holmes tapped the paper with his finger. After Lady Winfield's gathering, Crowley visited Harrow's house. He then visited Blackwood's, and shortly thereafter, he made inquiries at Wapping regarding a shipping broker named Dacre. Lestrade's eyes widened. How do you know that? Holmes's smile was faint. A man may conceal his movements from his neighbor's inspector, but not from tradesmen. A cabman remembers a fare. A messenger remembers an address. A doorman remembers a face. Crowley believed himself invisible because he moved politely. And these visits, I began, were conducted under the guise of reconciliation. Holmes finished. He was seen carrying a bottle of wine. He spoke of apologies. He presented himself as wounded but reasonable. Lestrade stared at him. Apologies don't knock men unconscious. No, Holmes agreed. But they open doors. Holmes reconstructed the subsequent encounters with chilling clarity. He described them not as speculation, but as a sequence demanded by motive and opportunity. Crowley visits Harrow, he said, pacing. Harrow admits him because Crowley is a gentleman, and because scandal would benefit neither. Crowley sits or stands close, speaking low, with that scarf around his throat. The scent transfers to Harrow's chair, to the heavy scarf in Harrow's wardrobe when Crowley brushes past it. Harrow later dismisses the visit as unpleasant but forgettable. Lestrade interjected. And then Harrow collapses. Holmes shook his head. Number not immediately. Crowley is patient. He makes his rounds. He speaks. He plants a memory and a trace. He turned toward the map. Next, he visits Blackwood. Blackwood, perhaps genuinely ill, receives him in a room with curtains such as those at Bloomsbury. Crowley stands near the window while he speaks, perhaps to avoid proximity to Blackwood's invalid chair. The scarf brushes the curtain. The scent bonds. And the third. Lestrade pressed. Holmes's eyes grew darker. The third is not a gentleman's drawing room, but a narrow hallway in a broker's office. Crowley could not enter as a friend there. He enters as a businessman. He hangs his coat, perhaps briefly, upon the stand, or he brushes the peg as he removes it. The scent remains faint, but present. Lestrade's face tightened. And the victims? What did Crowley want from them? Holmes's voice was quiet. He wanted compliance, endorsement. Silence, perhaps simply fear. You think he poisoned them? Lestrade demanded. Holmes's gaze returned to the wool strip on the table. Not with a crude poison, he said. With something subtle. Something that can be carried invisibly and administered without struggle. I felt a chill. Through the perfume. Holmes inclined his head. Or through what accompanied it. A perfume bottle offers plausible explanation for a lingering scent. But the incapacitation, no, that requires another agent. Lestrade leaned forward. Then why leave the scent at all? Why not avoid it? Holmes's answer was immediate. Because he believed it temporary. He believed time would erase the trace. He lifted the strip of wool and held it near the lamp. The amber and vetiver rose again with stubborn persistence. He underestimated the patience of amber and vetiver, Holmes murmured. Lestrade exhaled sharply. So Crowley thought he could visit them, threaten them, drug them, then walk away clean, leaving only a faint perfume as nothing more than a coincidence. A coincidence that points to 3 men, Holmes said. Not one, and yet, I added, his own scarf has betrayed him. Holmes's eyes flashed with quiet satisfaction. The base notes make liars of those who trust in time. Lestrade rose abruptly. Then we arrest him. Holmes raised a hand, calm as ever. Not yet. Lestrade groaned. Holmes. An arrest without the mechanism, Holmes said evenly, is an invitation to acquittal. Crowley is proud, wealthy, and well connected. If we seize him now, he will claim persecution. The scarf may arouse suspicion, but it will not convict. What will? I asked. Holmes's gaze turned inward, calculating. The means, he said. The method by which he rendered 3 men unconscious without injury. The substance, the delivery, and the proof that it passed through his hands. Lestrade's jaw clenched. And you intend to find it where? Holmes's expression was almost serene. In the one place gentlemen forget to hide their secrets, he replied. Among the instruments of their respectability. He walked to the window, staring out at the pale winter light. Crowley made his visits under the guise of reconciliation, he said softly. That is the mask he chose. Therefore his weapon must be something that can be carried under that mask. A bottle, a glove, a handkerchief, a letter. A letter, I repeated. Holmes nodded. A letter invites a man to lean close, to inhale, to read. It sits upon a desk. It is touched. It is warmed by the hand. I recalled then how each victim had been found near a desk, a chair, a hallway entry, places of reception. A delivery, I murmured. Holmes turned, his eyes bright. Yes, a delivery that leaves no wound, only a brief darkness. And, if Crowley believed time would erase it, he took no pains to consider that wool would remember what air forgot. Lestrade stood silent, absorbing the implications. Holmes returned to his chair and steepled his fingers, the old familiar pose of listening to distant music. The words spoken in jealousy, he said at last. Where the first act, the perfume was the misdirection, wool was the witness. Now we require the final, incontrovertible testimony, the substance itself. His gaze met mine, and for that, Watson, he added quietly, we must visit the man whom Crowley believed too insignificant to notice. Matthias Rourke's nephew. Chapter, Igfe Perfume against time. It is a singular misconception among men of refinement that knowledge belongs exclusively to books and laboratories. They forget that knowledge, in the hands of a determined mind, becomes a lever capable of moving even the heaviest of human certainties. Holmes's science was not the indulgence of a scholar, but the instrument of a hunter. When at last he chose to confront Edwin Crowley, it was with the calm inevitability of a man who has already seen the end of the road and now walks it only to demonstrate its shape. Lestrade wished, indeed insisted, upon arrest. We have enough, he argued in our sitting room at Baker Street, his hat clenched in his fist. A scarf that reeks of the stuff, a motive and a pattern. We can bring him in now. Holmes did not look up from the small notebook upon which he had been sketching, a series of times, dates, and locations that resembled, to my eyes, the workings of a railway timetable. No, he said quietly. Lestrade's face flushed. No, Holmes, for once in your life. For once in my life. Holmes interrupted with mild severity. Permit me to finish the game as it ought to be finished. Crowley is not a man to be bullied by uniform. He is a man to be cornered by certainty. Lestrade exhaled sharply, but he had worked with Holmes often enough to recognize the futility of further protest. And how? He demanded. Do you propose to corner him? Holmes closed the notebook and slipped it into his pocket. With truth delivered politely, he replied. It is the form of weapon he least expects. We called upon. I felt my stomach tighten. Chloral hydrate, sedative, capable of rapid unconsciousness if administered in sufficient quantity. Crowley's eyes widened. Holmes's tone remained almost gentle. You see, he said, chemistry is a faithful historian. It records what men deny. Crowley's shoulders sagged, as though the weight of inevitability had finally settled upon him. The cultivated composure that had so impressed his neighbors dissolved like mist in sunlight. He sank back into his chair, staring at the scarf as if it were a living thing. I did not mean to kill them, he whispered. Lestrade lunged forward. So you admit it? Crowley flinched. Holmes's voice was steady. Continue. Crowley pressed a hand to his brow. They thought they could humiliate me, he said. Harrow with his letters and his smug certainty, Blackwood pretending peace while he profited, Lady Winfield. His voice caught. She smiled at them as though I were irrelevant. Holmes's eyes did not soften, but I sensed the moral gravity beneath his detachment. And so you chose to demonstrate power, Holmes said quietly. Crowley's lips trembled. I only wanted them to feel, just once, how it is to be helpless, to wake and know you were at another man's mercy. And Dacre, Lestrade demanded. Crowley's laugh was bitter. He was a tool, another obstacle, all of them obstacles. Holmes leaned forward slightly. You used the perfume to misdirect suspicion, he said, because 3 men wore it at Lady Winfield's gathering, and you believed no one could distinguish which of you carried it later. Crowley nodded miserably. Yes, I thought. It would fade. I thought time would cover my tracks. Holmes lifted the scarf once more. But it did not, he said. Crowley buried his face in his hands. I left by the rear gate, he whispered. My servants never saw. They told the truth. I only stepped out. Lestrade rose, his face grim with satisfaction. That will do, he said. You are under arrest. Crowley did not resist. He seemed, in that moment, more exhausted than defiant. As we left the house with him in custody, I glanced back once. The conservatory, with its misted glass and winter plants, seemed suddenly less a place of cultivated leisure than a cage of confession. Holmes walked beside me in silence until we reached the lane beyond the garden wall. Then he spoke softly, almost to himself. Perfume against time, he murmured. A poor wager for any man who believes the world forgets as quickly as he does. And yet, I said, it nearly succeeded. Holmes's eyes were distant. It would have, he replied, had he relied upon something less patient than amber and vetiver. Chapter X-Fay, the scent that stayed when the case of Valois Nocturne had at last run its course through the magistrate's court and into the quiet machinery of justice. I found myself reflecting, as I often do, upon the curious disproportion between cause and consequence. No blood had been spilled, no pistol discharged, no safe forced open in the dead of night, and yet 3 men had been rendered helpless, their reputations imperiled, and an entire circle of society shaken, all by the invisible agency of resentment and scent. Didwin Crowley's confession once made proved as complete as Holmes had anticipated. Confronted not with bluster, but with method, he had recognized the futility of denial. The chloral hydrate, dissolved in a faintly sweetened tincture and brushed along the inner folds of correspondence, had produced precisely the effect intended. Each victim, leaning close to examine a document presented under guise of reconciliation, had inhaled a dose sufficient to induce sudden unconsciousness. No bruises, no marks, only bewilderment upon waking and the humiliating knowledge of vulnerability. The perfume had been Crowley's flourish, an elegant misdirection, because all 3 gentlemen had worn Valois Nocturne at Lady Winfield's gathering. The fragrance might implicate any or none. He had believed that the shared cloud of scent would disperse suspicion as readily as it had once filled that drawing room. He had miscalculated. In the weeks following his arrest, Holmes received more than one letter praising the resolution of a matter which Scotland Yard had initially found so perplexing. Lestrade, to his credit, acknowledged with restrained good humor that scent had triumphed where routine inquiry had stalled. I shall never again dismiss a curtain, he remarked, dryly during one of his visits to Baker Street. Or a scarf. Holmes only smiled. "You may dismiss them," he said, "so long as you do not neglect them." For myself, I could not easily forget the moment in Crowley's conservatory when the warmed wool had released its secret into the air. There had been something almost poetic, if poetry may be found in guilt, about the way the fragrance rose, steady and undeniable, as though summoned by truth itself. Holmes, however, regarded the matter with characteristic detachment. "You see, Watson," he said one evening, as we sat by the fire, "the tyranny of small details is often underestimated. Men fortify doors and bribe servants. They neglect fibers and molecules." I watched the faint spiral of his tobacco smoke curl upward, already thinning as it drifted toward the ceiling. "No bloodstain betrayed Crowley," I said thoughtfully. "No eyewitness saw him leave his house. No object was stolen to trace his path. And yet," Holmes replied, "a fragrance lingered too long upon honest wool." He rose and crossed to the cabinet, where the experimental strip still lay. Preserved as reference, he lifted one briefly, then set it down again. "Amber resin," he murmured. "Smoked vetiver, unassuming components, yet remarkably steadfast. You speak of them as though they possessed moral character," I observed. Holmes's eyes glinted faintly. "In a sense, they do. They obey law without prejudice. They record without emotion. They do not forget, because forgetting is not within their nature." The jealous words of a single evening, spoken beneath chandeliers and softened by wine, had echoed through 3 households. They had traveled not as threats shouted in anger, but as measured visits, polite smiles, and letters sealed with courtesy. The scent borne invisibly upon the air had been both disguise and signature. Lady Winfield, I learned, withdrew for a time from society. Whether from embarrassment or reflection, I cannot say. Blackwood and Harrow resumed their pursuits, though with a certain caution toward partnerships. The railway scheme, stripped of rivalry, proceeded under altered leadership, and Crowley. He faced the consequences of his calculated vanity. Holmes had observed with some severity that the desire to inspire fear often results in self-destruction. Crowley had wished to demonstrate power without bloodshed. Instead, he demonstrated only that pride, once wounded, may seek remedy in folly. As I pen these lines, the faint aroma of Holmes's tobacco curls beside me, already fading into forgetfulness. Even now it diminishes, yielding to the ordinary air of our sitting room. Soon, no trace of it will remain. Yet, I cannot help recalling how that rare perfume defied time. It clung stubbornly to fabric and to guilt alike. It persisted in curtains and in scarves, in chairbacks and in the quiet grain of wood. It endured beyond expectation, beyond intention, beyond denial. Holmes, seated opposite me, appears once more in that familiar attitude. Long fingers steepled, eyes half closed, as though listening to some distant harmony only he can hear. To the casual observer, he might seem at rest. I know better. His mind is never idle. It merely waits for the next discordant note in the vast symphony of London's secrets. "In the end," I said softly, closing my notebook, "it was not a man who remembered too clearly." Holmes's lips curved in the faintest smile. "No," he agreed. "It was a scent that refused to forget." Outside, the fog drifts once more along Baker Street, veiling the lamps and softening the outlines of the world. Within, the fire burns steadily, casting its warm light upon shelves of monographs and chemical instruments. Justice, in this instance, was not served by force, nor by confession wrung through intimidation. It was served by observation, by patience, and by the quiet persistence of Perfume. And thus concluded the strangest investigation of my companion's career, a case in which memory faltered, alibis wavered, and pride deceived, but chemistry remained steadfast, recording faithfully what men sought to erase.